She smiled before she did it. I will never forget that smile. It was the kind of smile a person gives right before they flip your entire world upside down, as if they had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Savannah lifted her cranberry cocktail with a calmness that felt almost rehearsed. The red liquid glowed under the chandelier lights, shimmering like something dangerous. She held it up as if to toast me, then tilted her wrist ever so slightly. The cocktail spilled in a slow, deliberate stream, staining the front of my cream dress in one sweeping motion. It splashed cold against my skin, blooming into a dark red shape that looked almost like a wound spreading across my body. For a full second, no one made a sound. Not the pianist, not the servers, not the 200 guests standing around us. The entire charity gala froze. But the moment that broke me was not the drink. It was Ethan, my husband. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a confused laugh, a real laugh. The kind a man gives when he is watching something amusing, something he has seen before and decided he is comfortable with. He did not reach for a napkin. He did not step between us. He did not even flinch. He simply stood there, one hand in his pocket, smiling at Savannah like she had just performed a charming party trick. Someone near the stage gasped loudly enough to echo across the marble floor. The pianist struck a wrong note, then stopped playing altogether. Camera flashes stuttered and halted midair. Conversations died midway through sentences, voices fading into a suffocating silence. It felt like the entire room leaned closer to witness what would happen next. I could feel the cold cocktail dripping down my dress and onto my shoes, but the sting in my chest was sharper than the chill on my skin. Savannah lowered her empty glass and gave me another smile, soft and sweet, the kind of smile only a woman with too much confidence and too few boundaries would dare to use. Ethan did not say my name. He did not ask if I was all right. He simply watched. Everyone saw the stain, but only I saw the betrayal. And in that instant, I knew this night was not going to end quietly. Something inside the room had cracked open. Whispers began to weave through the crowd, uncertainty replacing glamour, tension replacing elegance. The evening had only just begun, and already it felt like a storm was forming on the horizon, ready to swallow everything I thought I understood about my marriage, my place in the Bennett family, and the truth I had been avoiding for far too long. The Bennett Lake estate had always felt like another world to me, a world polished to perfection and guarded by manners sharp enough to cut. That night, the $3 million mansion sat beside the still water like a glowing monument to wealth, every window lit, every surface reflecting the gold of chandeliers and the soft flicker of candlelight. Guests drifted through the grand entryway wearing tailored suits, floor-length gowns, and expressions that suggested they had never once questioned their place in this circle of privilege. Doctors, CEOs, former military officers, city council members, and donors with last names that opened doors walked through the ballroom as if floating perfectly rehearsed in the silent choreography of high society. I had attended enough Bennett events to know how this world worked. Appearances meant everything. Image mattered more than truth, and people smiled even when their eyes were calculating. And somewhere along the way, I had learned to shrink myself just enough to avoid disturbing that carefully arranged balance. Before marrying Ethan, I was an art teacher in a public high school, the kind who stayed late to clean brushes and tape paper to drying racks. I loved color texture mistakes, messy creativity things this family considered charming only when displayed but not lived. Stepping into the Bennett world meant stepping into silence, learning how to speak softly, how to keep my movements graceful, how to blend into a room full of diamonds and ego. I became the polite wife, the agreeable wife, the wife who never asked for too much and never made a scene. I told myself that made me adaptable. Looking back now, it made me invisible. The charity gala was supposed to be elegant, predictable, and safe. Plush carpeting, muted footsteps, champagne flutes clinked in polite rhythm, and a jazz trio played near the balcony doors overlooking the lake. But beneath the surface, tension had already begun to ripple subtle but present like a current waiting for the right moment to break open. It started when Savannah arrived. I did not know her well, not truly. I only knew that she joined Ethan's firm 6 months ago after a business trip that he claimed had gone incredibly well. Since then, her name had appeared more in our conversations than I was comfortable with. He called her ambitious, intelligent, a visionary. I tried to believe him when he insisted she was simply valuable to the company, but the way some people at the gala watched her told another story entirely. There were glances, small nods, the kind of subtle acknowledgments that carried an unspoken message she belonged. And worse, the way they looked at me suggested they thought she belonged more than I did. I noticed Margaret Bennett, my mother-in-law, watching Savannah with something close to approval. Margaret was a master of image maintenance, and she adored women who projected confidence and sharpness. I had never been sharp enough for her. I was watercolor in a family of steel. When Savannah laughed at something Ethan whispered to her, several guests turned to look not at them, but at me. Their eyes softened with what felt like pity. Pity is a dangerous thing at an event like this. It meant they already sensed the imbalance, already saw the shift in loyalty, already predicted the fracture before I allowed myself to acknowledge it. I stood alone near the far side of the ballroom, trying to focus on the lake through the enormous windows. Its mirror-smooth surface should have calmed me. Instead, it felt like a reminder of how perfectly still I had forced myself to become inside this family. How easily a single disruption could shatter everything. Every now and then, a guest approached with polite small talk. Their words felt thin. Their compliments felt rehearsed. Their smiles felt distant. And under all of it was the quiet pressure that always accompanied these events. Stand gracefully. Do not offend. Do not embarrass. Do not fail to uphold the Bennett reputation. I pretended not to notice the lingering glances toward Savannah and Ethan, their silhouettes glowing under the chandelier, like a pair meant to be admired. But deep down, something tightened a feeling I had tried for months to ignore. That sense of being replaced, of being evaluated, of being compared. And in that space between the music and the murmurs, the truth settled over me like a weight I could not shake. I was the outsider in a room I was supposed to call home. Savannah did not simply enter the ballroom, she claimed it. The moment she stepped through the archway, the atmosphere shifted as if someone had drawn back heavy curtains to let in too much light. Her dress was a deep, commanding red that clung to her frame, like it was crafted specifically for the purpose of being noticed. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sleek updo, exposing the sharp lines of her jaw and the dangerous confidence in her smile. She walked the way only certain women could walk, the kind who understood exactly how much attention they deserved and how much damage they could do with it. The soft click of her heels on the marble floor cut through the music, subtle but impossible to ignore a sound that announced her presence long before she reached the center of the room. People turned, heads lifted. Even the pianist seemed to sit up straighter. I told myself I was imagining the shift in energy, but the truth was undeniable. I felt it in the way conversations softened, in the way eyes flicked between her and Ethan, who moved toward her almost instinctively as if pulled by an invisible thread. I stayed near the window where the cool air from the lake seeped through the glass. I wanted to be nothing more than a quiet observer, someone who did not have to feel the twist in her stomach every time Savannah's laugh floated across the room. But pretending not to care was becoming harder with each passing second. She saw me before she approached. Her gaze brushed over me with the same dismissive sweep a person might use on a wilted flower arrangement, something intended to beautify the room, but ultimately forgettable. Then she walked straight toward me. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt more like venom. "I didn't know you were coming tonight." Of course she knew. She had studied me the way women like her always studied the woman they intended to replace. I managed a polite smile. "It's a family event," I said. "I always attend." Her eyebrows lifted not in surprise but amusement, as though my answer had been a punchline. Ethan joined us a moment later, adjusting his tie in that subtle way he did whenever Savannah was near. He stood straighter, shoulders pushed back, his confidence shifting into something showier, something performative. "Savannah was just telling me about the work she did on the West Coast proposal," he said. "We were up until 2 finishing revisions. Up until 2. The words slid into my mind with alarming ease. I felt my stomach tighten, but Savannah did not give me time to process it. "He's brilliant under pressure," she said, placing a gentle hand on Ethan's arm as if staking a claim. "We make a great team." Before I could respond, a man beside us, Someone from city council asked, "Oh, you two know each other well." Savannah turned her eyes toward me, slow and deliberate, her lips curving into a grin that hid nothing. "Very well," she said. The implication hung in the air long enough for the councilman to blink awkwardly and excuse himself. I felt the room tilt, not physically but emotionally, like the floor was no longer stable beneath me. Savannah thrived on subtle destruction. She did not need to shout or insult or confront. She simply needed to drop hints, plant seeds, tilt the story just enough that people filled in the rest themselves. Ethan didn't deny any of it. He didn't correct her. He didn't step back. He just smiled, his silence a quiet confirmation that stung deeper than any insult. In that moment, she was not just dangerous. She was inevitable. And for the first time, I sensed that the humiliation she delivered later that night was not spontaneous. It was planned. Or worse, welcomed. I waited until Ethan stepped away from the crowd before approaching him, hoping that if I caught him alone without Savannah's shadow hanging over his shoulder, he might at least look at me the way a husband should. The music swelled behind us as guests drifted toward the silent auction tables, but all I could focus on was the rapid beat in my chest and the question that had been clawing at me for weeks. When he finally turned to face me, I spoke softly, careful not to draw attention. "Ethan, can we talk for a moment?" He exhaled with irritation so subtle that only someone who loved him would have noticed it. "Clara, not now," he muttered without meeting my eyes. "This event is important." "I know," I said, trying to steady my voice. "But the way Savannah is acting—" He cut me off with a sharp shake of his head. "Stop imagining things. Savannah is being professional. You're being emotional. Emotional." The word landed like a shove. It was not loud or cruel, but it was dismissive in a way that stung immediately, a quiet accusation that I was the problem. He straightened his jacket and scanned the room already halfway out of the conversation. "Ethan, I tried again. She's crossing boundaries and you know it." "Clara," he snapped under his breath, "do not ruin the night. Ruin the night." He said it as if the only possible person who could cause damage was me. Not the woman draping herself over him. Not the affair everyone seemed to sense, but no one spoke about. Me. While he walked away, Savannah drifted back into view, swooping in like a red flame. She hooked her arm lightly around his, as if she had been waiting for me to fail at holding his attention. "There you are," she said to him, not even acknowledging I existed. "We should go over talking points before the donors arrive." Of course, he replied, already easing into the role she carved for him. Watching them walk together felt like watching someone else live the life I was supposed to have. The guests noticed, too. A pair of women near the punch table whispered behind manicured fingers. A man in a navy suit gave Savannah an approving nod that made bile rise in my throat. And the pitying glances, the ones I dreaded most, started to appear like tiny cracks in the evening. I stepped back toward the edge of the room, away from the cluster of voices pretending to examine a series of framed foundation photographs. But even there, I was not free from the quiet judgment swirling around me like perfume I did not choose to wear. Margaret approached with her perfect posture and permanent half-smile, the one that suggested warmth but had never truly belonged to me. She did not greet me with a hug or a kiss on the cheek. Instead, she scanned my dress, my hair, my shoes, as if assessing whether I had managed to meet the family's standards tonight. She tilted her head. "Clara, dear, maybe dress more confidently next time." It was not a suggestion. It was a verdict. "You look sweet," she added the word sweet, delivered the way someone might describe a child who had tried but failed to impress. I swallowed the sting behind my ribs, managing a quiet "thank you," even though nothing about her tone sounded like a compliment. She was already looking past me, her eyes following Ethan and Savannah across the ballroom with something disturbingly close to approval. When she walked away, my throat tightened with something I could no longer deny. I was standing alone in a room full of people who claimed to be family. A room where I had become decorative, a background element, not someone who mattered. I moved toward the balcony doors in search of fresh air, but every step felt heavier, as though the carpet itself resisted my escape. My reflection in the glass barely looked like me, stiff shoulders forced, smile eyes clouded with doubt. Behind me, laughter rose from a cluster of guests surrounding Ethan and Savannah. His laugh was richer, louder, freer than anything I had heard from him in months. It was reserved for her now, not for me. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne passed by and gave me a sympathetic look before quickly averting his gaze as if he feared being caught showing kindness. It dawned on me then that sympathy was becoming the only thing people felt toward me anymore. A woman in a silver dress leaned toward her friend and whispered something while glancing directly at me. Her friend nodded with the expression one might use during a tragic wedding speech. That look, that mixture of pity and inevitability hollowed my chest more than any insult could have. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to keep the air in my lungs steady, but the truth pressed harder and harder. I was no longer Clara Bennett, wife of Ethan Bennett. I was the outsider, the inconvenience, the soon-to-be replaced, and even though the night had not yet shattered, the first fractures were already forming. I just had not realized how quickly they would split open. It happened so quickly and yet so slowly that my mind recorded every detail with painful clarity. I had returned to the center of the ballroom not because I wanted to be seen, but because standing alone by the balcony made me feel even more invisible than before. I thought blending into the crowd again would give me a moment of normalcy, a chance to breathe without feeling the weight of judgment on every inch of my skin. I was wrong. Savannah appeared at my side as if summoned by my smallest flicker of vulnerability. Her red dress shimmered beneath the chandelier, drawing the gaze of several guests who were already watching her far more than they were watching the charity auction. She approached with a drink in her hand and a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. I could sense it before she spoke, the subtle crackle of tension that always followed her like a warning sign. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Standing all by yourself again?" I stiffened, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm fine." "Of course you are," she replied, her smile widening as if she had just been handed an invitation to misbehave. Ethan joined her seconds later, sliding to her side with the ease of someone returning to his rightful place. He didn't look at me first. He looked at her. Always her. A waiter carrying a tray of cocktails walked by, and Savannah plucked one off the tray with a slow grace that made the air around us tighten. I saw the shift in her eyes, a spark, a decision. And before I could move, she stumbled forward in a dramatic, almost theatrical motion, letting out a soft gasp. Her foot didn't slip. There was no uneven floor. No one had bumped her. But she leaned into the act so convincingly that someone watching from across the room might have believed it. She tilted the glass forward, and the cranberry cocktail arced through the air in a red streak before splattering across the front of my cream dress. The liquid spread instantly, sinking into the fabric like it had been waiting for this exact moment. A chorus of gasps rippled through the ballroom. Someone dropped a fork. Another person muttered a curse under their breath. But most people simply froze. Their faces shifted from polite interest to shock-widened fascination. My breath caught in my throat. The cold seeped through my dress and onto my skin, but the humiliation burned hotter than any liquid could. Savannah straightened, brushing imaginary dust from her shoulder. "Oh my God, Clara," she said with exaggerated horror. "You should really watch where you're standing." Ethan didn't rush to me. He didn't shield me. He didn't even reach out a hand. Instead, he placed his palm lightly on Savannah's back, as if comforting her. "She bumped into you, Savannah," he said loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "Don't apologize." For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard him, if shock had distorted his words. But the smirk on Savannah's face confirmed it. He was protecting her, defending her, publicly choosing her narrative over mine without hesitation. My dress clung to me heavy and cold. I stared at Ethan, waiting for him to at least look at me to offer the smallest gesture of kindness. But when he finally turned toward me, his eyes held not worry, but annoyance, like I had caused the scene. A woman in her 70s, her gray hair pinned neatly in soft curls, whispered loudly to her husband. "Why isn't her husband helping her?" Her voice cut through the tension like a knife, and several guests nodded subtly. It was the first sign that the crowd was beginning to shift, that what they were seeing was wrong. But the weight of the humiliation pressed down on me harder than their whispers could lift. My throat tightened and the room began to blur around the edges. I took a shaky step back, needing space, needing air, needing anything that wasn't this crushing moment. But the crowd only stepped closer, forming a widening circle around us. The jazz band faltered, the piano player missing yet another note before letting his hands fall away from the keys entirely. A cluster of younger guests near the silent auction had their phones out, not raised, but ready hesitation flickering across their faces as they debated whether this moment was too explosive or too tempting to ignore. A few discreetly hit record. A few didn't bother hiding the fact. Ethan glanced toward them and then toward me with irritation as if I were responsible for their curiosity. "Clara," he said under his breath. "Stop making this a scene." A scene I whispered back, barely able to form the word. "I didn't do anything." Savannah let out a soft laugh, shaking her head in faux sympathy. "Accidents happen. Try not to be dramatic." Her tone was sweet enough to rot teeth. The humiliation pulsed through me, thick and hot, filling every corner of my chest until I could hardly breathe. I felt small, exposed, terribly, painfully alone. And yet something inside me stirred a tiny ember pressed beneath layers of ash. I wasn't ready to defend myself. Not yet, but I felt the first spark of anger cut through the fog of humiliation. Then the next shift happened. A phone flashed, then another, and another. Someone whispered, "Are you getting this?" Someone else replied, "Already did." The scene was no longer just a moment. It was evidence. It was spreading. And for the first time that night, Savannah's confident smile flickered just barely as if she realized she might have pushed too far. But Ethan didn't see it. He wasn't watching her anymore. He was watching me, frustration lining his jaw, his posture rigid, his expression begging me to stay silent. I took another step back, my dress dripping my dignity, unraveling thread by thread. The room spun with whispers, shifting alliances, widening eyes. The humiliation was complete, but the night wasn't over, not even close. I backed away from the tightening circle of guests, desperate for air, desperate for distance, desperate for anything that wasn't the choking humiliation burning through my chest. My heels clicked unevenly against the marble as I slipped out of the ballroom and into the long hallway leading toward the side lounge. The dimmer lighting should have felt calming, but instead it made the shadows sharper, the silence heavier, and the sting of everything that had just happened even more unbearable. I barely made it 10 steps before I heard Ethan's voice behind me. "Clara." I didn't stop. I couldn't. But he caught up quickly, his footsteps purposeful, the sound of someone coming not to comfort, but to reprimand. He reached out and grabbed my arm firm, not violent, but forceful enough to make me freeze. I turned toward him, my chest rising and falling as the remnants of shame and anger churned inside me. His face was tight, jaw clenched, eyes burning not with worry but irritation. "You embarrassed me," he hissed. The words punched the air out of my lungs. Of all the things he could have said, "Are you all right? I'm sorry. Let me help you." This was what he chose. I stared at him speechless. "Ethan." I managed. "She threw a drink on me in front of everyone." He shook his head. "And you made it worse by walking out like that." "Everyone's talking." "Everyone was already talking," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They saw what she did." "You bumped into her?" he snapped. "Stop trying to twist things." The gaslighting hit with surgical precision, sharp and practiced. My mind struggled to keep hold of the truth. I had not bumped into her. I had stood perfectly still. She had tipped the glass on purpose, and yet he said it with such certainty that for a tiny second, I questioned my own memory. Savannah's heels clicked leisurely as she entered the hallway behind him, her silhouette framed by the glow of the ballroom lights. She crossed her arms and leaned against the wall as if settling in to enjoy a private show. "Sweetheart," she said to me with that same syrupy tone she weaponized so well. "Accidents happen. Try not to be dramatic." I almost laughed from disbelief. Dramatic. The word felt absurd after everything she had orchestrated, and yet she said it with such confidence, such practiced innocence, that someone less aware might have believed her. But I wasn't alone in the hallway. A young Hispanic waiter, the same one who had carried the tray earlier, hovered at the corridor's edge. He looked pale conflicted, as if fighting an internal battle about whether to speak. Then he stepped forward, voice quiet but steady. "Ma'am," he said to me, "they caught it on camera. I saw everything." Ethan turned sharply. "Stay out of this." But the waiter didn't back down. She didn't bump into anyone, he said. It was intentional. Savannah let out a scoff she couldn't hide in time. Ethan shot her a warning look, but it was too late. The truth had cracked through her performance. Voices drifted from the ballroom, growing louder as small pockets of guests replayed the video on their phones. Someone said, "Did you see what that blonde did?" Another voice followed. "Is the husband serious? He's defending her." The murmurs grew, spreading like a spark through dry brush. Savannah's smirk wavered. A flicker of panic flashed in her eyes, quickly smothered by another layer of composure. "People will believe whatever story they want," she said. "Theirs doesn't matter." "It matters to me," I shot back. My voice wasn't loud, but it was firmer than before, carrying a weight I didn't fully recognize as my own. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice to a sharp whisper. "This is exactly the behavior that makes people question you. You're always so sensitive. Sensitive. Dramatic. Imagining things. Words designed not to soothe, but to dismantle. Words meant to shrink me small enough to fit his version of the world." I felt myself trembling, but not with fear this time. With anger. And betrayal. And something else resolve. "I didn't do anything wrong," I said. He scoffed. "You walked away." "Because I was humiliated," I replied. "In front of 200 people." Savannah shrugged, inspecting her nails. "You really should learn to laugh these things off." "Confidence, darling. It's not that hard." I stared at her, a bitter mix of disbelief and fury clawing its way upward. "You humiliated me," I said, voice shaking now, not from weakness, but from fighting to keep it controlled. "You planned it. You wanted people to see." "Oh, please," she replied, rolling her eyes. "No one pays attention to you that much." Ethan didn't defend me. He didn't correct her. He didn't even flinch. His silence wrapped around me like a noose tightening with every passing second. Then another sound broke through the tension. A ding. Then another. Phone notifications echoing from the ballroom. Someone murmured, "It's already in the group chat." Another said, "People are forwarding it." The hallway felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier, the walls pressing inward with the weight of rapidly spreading truth. Ethan's composure cracked. Panic flickered across his features. "Clara," he said sharply, "you need to go in there and tell people you tripped." My heart dropped. "I'm not lying," I said. "You will," he insisted, stepping closer, towering over me with the force of a command. "You will fix this." A cold calm washed over me in that moment, cutting through the chaos like a single, steady line of clarity. "No," I said. One word. Soft, but solid. Savannah's smirk finally disappeared. Ethan blinked. And for the first time that night, I felt the beginning of a shift, not around me, but inside me. The humiliation had broken something open, but it had also awakened something that refused to be buried again. The night had cracked wide open, and none of us had any idea how far the consequences would spread. The hallway began to vibrate with the muffled noise of dozens of phones buzzing at once, a rising chorus of alerts and whispers spilling through the air like a warning from another room. It was impossible not to feel the shift the moment the humiliation stopped being a private wound and became something far larger, something alive and moving beyond anyone's control. I could hear guests murmuring as they replayed the recording, their voices threading through the music that the band had awkwardly resumed. Someone near the ballroom entrance said, "It's already in the main donor group chat." Another voice added, "And the town Facebook group. People are commenting already." The panic in Ethan's eyes sharpened into something cold and frantic. He stepped toward me again, but this time his voice came out louder, rougher, the veneer of composure cracking. Clara, this is getting out of hand. You need to fix this now. Fix what? I asked, my voice quieter but far steadier than his. Your mistress dumping a drink on me? Stop calling her that, he snapped. You know how this looks. If you don't say it was an accident, people will think you're unstable. Unstable. Sensitive. Dramatic. The familiar pattern clicked into place, a script he expected me to follow so he could reclaim control over a situation that no longer bent to his will. Savannah stepped between us slightly, her arms crossed, trying to appear calm, even as her eyes darted toward the ballroom every few seconds. Ethan is right, she said, her voice coated with false sympathy. You need to tell people you tripped. Just say you lost your balance. I didn't trip, I said. Everyone saw what happened. No, sweetheart, she replied, lowering her voice as if speaking to a child. They saw what they think happened. Huge difference. Behind her, a group of younger guests lingered at the edge of the hallway, pretending to be checking their phones, but very clearly listening. One of them muttered, She's lying, it's all in the video. Another whispered, He's really trying to silence her. The cracks grew wider. Ethan heard those whispers too, and his expression tightened. Clara, he said again, but this time there was a note of desperation beneath the anger. Please, you're making this worse. No, I said I'm telling the truth. The truth, however, was no longer mine alone to protect. It had multiplied, carried from phone to phone, message to message, whispered conversation to whispered conversation. A middle-aged woman stepped out of the ballroom holding her phone like a piece of evidence. She glanced at me, then at Ethan, then back at her screen. My sister works at the local paper, she said, her tone low but firm. She's asking what exactly happened here tonight. Ethan's face drained of color. No, he said quickly, turning to her. Tell her it was a misunderstanding. Nothing more. Is that true? She asked, her gaze shifting back to me. It was a simple question, one that required only a simple answer. I lifted my eyes to meet hers. No, I said. It isn't. She held my gaze a moment longer, then nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. Behind her, I heard the sound of a notification chiming again. Someone else gasped softly. The video just hit 2,000 views, a man muttered under his breath. How is it spreading that fast? People are screen recording it, another answered. Once it's out, it's out. Savannah's composure cracked for the first time, her jaw tightening as she stepped closer to Ethan. Make her stop, she whispered harshly. Do something. But he couldn't. No amount of gaslighting or dismissive comments could erase the recording or silence the guests who had witnessed every second. He turned back to me with a look that mixed fear, resentment, and a plea he didn't know how to form. Clara, he said, trying again. If you ever cared about this family, I cared, I replied quietly. But caring doesn't mean lying. The hallway seemed to still around us, as if the walls themselves recognized that something fundamental had shifted. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Savannah swallowed hard, her facade slipping inch by inch. From the ballroom, another murmur rose louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of tension building toward confrontation. The video had escaped them. The truth had escaped them. And the consequences were coming fast, carried on the current of a growing, unstoppable storm. The moment James Bennett stepped into the hallway, the air shifted so sharply it felt as if the entire mansion inhaled at once. Conversations in the ballroom faltered, footsteps slowed, and even the distant music wobbled, as though the pianist himself sensed the change. James didn't march or rush. He simply walked with the kind of authority that didn't need volume or speed to be felt. His presence always carried weight, but tonight it carried something heavier, something colder, something that made every person in his path straighten their posture and lower their eyes. He stopped several steps away from us. His gaze moved past Ethan, past Savannah, past the growing crowd that hovered behind them, and landed squarely on me. And the look on his face was not anger, it was concern. Real, unmistakable concern. Clara. He said, his voice calm, but edged with steel. Are you hurt? No one had asked me that all night. The question pierced straight through the wall of humiliation that had been tightening around me. I swallowed hard. "I'm all right," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He took in the dripping stain on my dress, the redness around my eyes, the tension in my shoulders. His jaw tightened. Only then did he turn his gaze to his son. Ethan straightened, trying to recover the confidence he had lost in front of the ballroom. "Dad," he said with a forced laugh. "Thank God you're here." "There's been a huge misunderstanding." James lifted one hand sharply. "I wasn't speaking to you." The hallway went silent. Ethan's face dropped, his mouth snapping shut. Savannah stiffened at his side, her perfectly crafted confidence wobbling for the first time. James stepped closer, not to confront anyone, but to see me better. "Do you need a doctor? Water, a place to sit?" he asked quietly. His tone contrasted so violently with Ethan's earlier accusations that several guests exchanged glances in disbelief. "I'm fine," I whispered. "It was just public humiliation," a woman behind him muttered. Ethan swung around. "Stay out of this, please. This is a family matter." "It became more than that when half the room witnessed it," the woman replied. James held up his hand again, and silence reigned instantly. Then he shifted his attention to the crowd gathering behind him. "Someone show me the video," he said. There was no hesitation. 4 or 5 phones rose at once. A young man stepped forward, his thumb already hitting play. For a long, suffocating moment, the only sound in the hallway was the audio of my humiliation echoing from a screen. The gasp, the splash, Savannah's feigned surprise, Ethan's dismissive defense, every second played clearly, mercilessly, leaving no room for interpretation or manipulation. When the video ended, the hallway remained silent, as if waiting for James to deliver the verdict everyone knew was coming. His eyes, usually warm beneath their severity, turned ice cold as he looked at Ethan. "You let this happen!" Ethan lifted his hands in defense. "Dad?" "She's exaggerating. She always takes things personally. She made the situation worse by walking away." James didn't blink. "I saw the video." Ethan opened his mouth again, but James stepped forward, inches from his face. "Don't lie to me. Not tonight." Savannah tried to slide subtly behind Ethan, but James turned to her next, his gaze slicing clean through her last bits of arrogance. "Is there anything you'd like to explain?" She forced a smile, breath shaking slightly. "It was a complete accident, Mr. Bennett. She misunderstood what happened." "Replay it," James said. The young man played it again, and again there was no way to twist it, no way to paint me as dramatic, no way to claim innocence. When the video finished the second time, James looked from Savannah to Ethan, then back to me. "Clara," he said quietly, "you should never have been treated like this in my home." My throat tightened, my eyes burned, not from humiliation this time, but from the shock of finally being believed. Ethan stepped forward, voice rising. "Dad, this is getting blown way out of proportion. You're letting people misinterpret." "Enough," James said, not loud, but final. The crowd behind him stilled, almost reverent in their silence. The authority in his voice was absolute, the kind that ended arguments and started consequences. And in that moment, everyone knew something much larger than a spilled drink had been unleashed. James Bennett had entered the situation. And nothing would remain the same after this. The silence in the hallway thickened until it felt almost physical, pressing against everyone's skin. James stood perfectly still, his shoulders squared, his eyes locked on Ethan with a disappointment so sharp it made several guests shift uncomfortably. Ethan tried to hold his father's gaze, but the weight of it was too much. His eyes flickered away, landing briefly on me before darting back to the floor. "Dad," he said, voice tightening, "you're humiliating me in front of everyone." The irony was so staggering, a few people actually scoffed. James took one slow step forward. "You humiliated yourself." Ethan's jaw clenched and unclenched as he scrambled for control of the narrative slipping away from him. "She's exaggerating everything. Clara always makes things bigger than they are. Savannah didn't mean any harm." A murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief and disgust mixing in equal measure. James didn't look away from his son. "I saw the video," he repeated each word, deliberate and final. And I watched you lie to your wife in front of 200 people. Savannah tried to interject, her voice trembling slightly despite her forced composure. Mr. Bennett, James cut her off with a glare so sharp it froze her mid-sentence. Do not speak. Her lips snapped shut. Ethan let out an incredulous laugh, a desperate attempt to reclaim confidence. Dad, come on, you're being dramatic. This whole thing is ridiculous. And that was the moment it broke. The tension that had been building all night snapped like a brittle thread, unleashing something unstoppable. James stepped forward and, without raising his voice or warning, struck Ethan across the face. The sound cracked through the hallway like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. Someone covered their mouth. Another whispered, "Oh my God!" Ethan staggered sideways, one hand flying to his cheek as shock spread across his features. He wasn't hurt badly, not physically, but the humiliation, public undeniable, landed harder than the slap ever could. You will not disrespect your wife. James said, his voice steady, resonant, echoing through the hall. Not in my home. Not in this family. Ethan's stunned silence was answer enough. Savannah, pale now beneath the ballroom lights, took a step backward, as if distance alone could save her. But James turned toward her next. And you, he said, voice low with controlled fury. You walked into my home, used my event, and humiliated my daughter-in-law while my son, stood by and encouraged it. She swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the exit. A few guests shifted subtly, blocking her path. It was just a misunderstanding, she whispered. James didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Security, he said simply. 2 uniformed guards appeared almost instantly, having clearly been waiting for his signal. Escort her out, he ordered. Savannah's composure finally shattered. Ethan, she hissed, reaching for him. Tell him to stop. Ethan didn't move. He didn't defend her. He didn't even look at her. His silence condemned her far more efficiently than any words could. The guards stepped forward, taking position on either side of her. They didn't touch her yet, just stood close enough to signal that the decision wasn't hers anymore. Her breath hitched in disbelief. You can't be serious, she snapped. Over a spilled drink, a woman in the crowd responded coldly. We all saw the video. It wasn't a spill. You planned this, another added. Savannah's eyes widened, panic breaking fully through her facade. You people don't understand! The guards began guiding her toward the exit. She twisted, trying to throw one last glare my way, but it landed weakly, stripped of all its earlier certainty. And when she disappeared around the corner, the hallway exhaled as one. All eyes turned back to James. His voice softened as he faced me. No one, he said, treats you this way. Not here, not ever again. For the first time all night, I believed him. The hallway had barely settled before James turned away from Ethan and faced the crowd, his expression shifting from fury to something far more resolute. The kind of expression men like him carried into boardrooms and negotiations, the kind that signaled a decision had already been made. Everyone back to the ballroom, he said. There is something that must be addressed. His tone left no room for argument. Guests moved quickly, whispering as they returned to the gilded room, the chandeliers glittering overhead like 1,000 watchful eyes. Ethan followed behind us, nursing the burning red imprint on his cheek. He stayed several steps back, like he wasn't sure whether he should walk beside me or pretend we weren't connected at all. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. When we entered the ballroom, the musicians stopped mid-song, their fingers frozen above their instruments. Every head turned toward us. Phone screens glowed in trembling hands. Conversations halted. The humiliation that had once belonged solely to me now belonged to Ethan as well, and Savannah's absence was louder than any music could ever mask. James walked to the center of the room, commanding silence without a single gesture. He looked at me first, and something in his gaze, pride, protectiveness, maybe even regret, made my throat tighten. Then he looked at Ethan. Before this night continues, he said there is a truth everyone here needs to hear. Ethan stiffened. Dad, don't. But James lifted his hand again, and Ethan fell silent, instantly swallowing whatever desperate plea he had been about to make. Years ago, James began addressing the room rather than his son. I had to consider the future of this estate. My business, my assets, and this home needed to be protected for tax planning for inheritance purposes and to ensure stability in this family. A murmur rippled through the guests, soft but charged. Everyone in this circle understood the language of wealth. Tax planning, inheritance, stability. These were not casual words. James continued. At the time, Ethan was young, immature, impulsive, not yet prepared to shoulder the weight of responsibility that comes with this family name. Ethan's face flushed with humiliation. He stepped forward slightly. "Dad, that's not, you don't have to bring this up, I do," James said, not looking at him. "Because tonight, every person in this room witnessed the consequences of immaturity." My heart thudded harder. The room leaned in. James took a slow breath, then spoke clearly, deliberately, each word falling into the space like a stone. The deed to this mansion, the Bennett Lake estate, was placed in Clara's name years ago. Gasps erupted. Someone whispered, "You're kidding!" Another said, "No wonder he's losing it." Ethan froze, color draining from his face. "What?" He choked out. "Dad, why? Why would you do that?" James finally looked at his son, and his disappointment was sharper than anything he'd expressed before. "Because she had integrity," he said. "And she still does. Something you lost the moment you allowed another woman to humiliate your wife without lifting a finger." The room fell silent except for the faint echo of water lapping outside against the lake's edge. Ethan stared at me, his eyes widening with realization. "Clara, you knew I didn't," I said quietly. "Not until now." He shook his head, stepping closer like someone trying to keep from drowning. "Dad, you can't be serious. You can't just—" "I can," James said, cutting him off, "and I did." He turned back to the crowd. "Clara is the legal owner of this property. Every room, every acre, every dollar tied to it." People murmured again, but this time, their words carried admiration, support, vindication. Good for her. About time someone said something. She deserved better than him anyway. Ethan's breathing became uneven. "Dad, you made a mistake. She's not. She doesn't understand. She can't." "Enough," James said. "Stop assuming she is less capable simply because you favored a woman who smiled at you the right way." The room stiffened at the blow. Ethan opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. His eyes darted toward the doorway where Savannah had been escorted moments earlier, then back to me. Shame washed over his features, deep and consuming. James looked at me once more. "Clara," he said, his voice softening, "you have always carried yourself with grace. Tonight you were forced into humiliation you did not deserve. But you will not leave this house as a victim." And for the first time in hours, I felt something warm push against the coldness inside me. A shift. A reclaiming. The room watched me, waiting to see whether I would crumble or rise. I stood taller. James nodded once. "This house," he said, "belongs to you." And for the first time, I believed it. The ballroom felt impossibly still as James's words settled over the room, over me, over the fractured remnants of my marriage. Every pair of eyes shifted toward me with an intensity that should have made me shrink the way I had trained myself to shrink for years in this family. But something inside me refused to bend this time. Not after everything that had unfolded tonight. Not after the truth had finally been forced into the open where no one could twist it or bury it again. I stepped forward slowly, feeling the weight of 200 quiet expectations pressing against my skin. My dress was still damp, the red stain clinging like a bruise across my torso, but for once I didn't feel small inside it. I felt grounded, solid, present. I looked out at the faces staring back at me, people who had whispered about me, pitied me, ignored me, or watched me struggle in silence without ever stepping in. People who had never truly seen me at all until the moment humiliation dragged me into their view. I took a breath. My voice, when it finally emerged, was steady. I never wanted tonight to become what it became. I began. I came here to support this family, to represent it with dignity, and to simply do what I've always done, stand quietly beside my husband and not make a scene. A few guests lowered their eyes at the pointed echo of Ethan's earlier accusation. But silence, I continued, can be dangerous. It protects the wrong people. It gives power to cruelty disguised as confidence, to disrespect disguised as jokes, and to betrayal disguised as accidents. The crowd shifted, tension rippling through the air. I looked at Ethan then. He didn't meet my eyes. His shoulders dropped as though the weight of everything was finally beginning to hit him. I stayed quiet for a long time, I said. I told myself it was grace. I told myself it was patience. I told myself it was love. My breath trembled slightly, but I didn't hide it. But grace without boundaries becomes permission, and I refuse to continue giving permission to people who hurt me. A murmur swept the room, agreement. Surprise, something almost like pride. I let my gaze travel slowly across the faces around me. Humiliation does not define me, I said. Being ignored does not define me. Being betrayed does not define me. I touched the stain on my dress lightly. This doesn't define me. The lighting shifted slightly as the chandeliers flickered, casting warm reflections across the polished floors. The room felt smaller, closer, as though everyone leaned in without meaning to. What does define me, I said, is what I choose to do next. And tonight I choose myself. A few people exhaled softly, the emotional tension thickening. I will not be silenced. I will not be dismissed. And I will not carry the blame for actions I didn't commit. I lifted my chin, the truth settling into my bones with a new strength. This house may legally be mine, but that is not the victory. The victory is understanding that I never needed anyone's permission to demand respect. My voice dropped to a quiet finality that filled the entire room. I'm done being quiet. Not tonight. Not ever again. When I finished, no one moved at first. Then a woman near the front nodded slowly. Someone else murmured, "Good for her." And then, softly at first, but building gradually, the room began to shift. Not with applause, but with something far more meaningful. Recognition. The ballroom didn't return to its glittering elegance after my speech. It couldn't. Something irreversible had shifted, something deeper than embarrassment or scandal. The air carried a different weight now, a quiet acknowledgement that the woman they once overlooked had stepped into the light and refused to step back. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but the energy had transformed. People glanced at me with something not quite like sympathy anymore. It was respect. Quiet, steady, overdue respect. I stepped away from the center of the room, needing a moment to breathe somewhere that didn't smell like spilled cranberry and shame. As I moved toward the grand staircase, Ethan followed a few hesitant steps behind me. His voice came out strained, almost breaking. "Clara, please, we need to talk." I paused at the bottom of the steps, my hand brushing the polished banister. For years, I would have turned to him instantly, desperate to fix things, terrified of losing him, willing to bend myself into whatever shape he needed, but not tonight. Not after everything. I turned to face him, and for the first time, I didn't feel small in his presence. I didn't feel uncertain. I didn't feel fragile. He looked at me with eyes clouded by panic, regret, confusion, emotions he had never allowed himself to show in public. "I messed up," he said. "I know I did, but we can figure this out. Just, please don't walk away like this." I studied him quietly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the truth to settle. "Not tonight, Ethan," I said, "and maybe not ever." His face crumpled, but I didn't let myself absorb it. I couldn't. The staircase loomed before me, elegant and familiar, a place I had walked countless times, feeling like a guest, a visitor, an outsider. But tonight, everything was different. Tonight, this house was mine. I placed one foot on the first step, the soft carpet cushioning the weight of a decision I had been avoiding for too long. From the corner of my eye, I saw guests watching, whispering, witnessing the final unraveling of a story that had been happening in silence long before the cocktail ever hit my dress. I climbed another step, then another. At the landing, the chandelier's warm light spilled across my shoulders, casting a glow that felt almost symbolic. A beginning, not an ending. I turned slightly, taking in the scene below, the stunned faces, the murmurs, Ethan standing frozen in the middle of the room, James watching me with something akin to pride. And then the truth settled over me with a quiet certainty. I wasn't leaving the room as a victim. I wasn't leaving as a woman scorned. I wasn't leaving as someone broken. I was leaving as the owner of this mansion, the woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows and reclaimed her life. I took a slow, steady breath. Then I turned fully away from them all. I walked back inside the mansion, not as a guest, but as the owner. If you stayed with me until the end, I want to leave you with this. Life has a way of placing us in rooms where people underestimate us, silence us, or treat us as if we should be grateful for the smallest corner of their attention. Sometimes the ones who claim to love us are the very people who teach us to shrink. But the truth is this: your worth is not defined by who fails to see it. Your value does not disappear because someone else feels threatened by it. You do not owe your silence to anyone who benefits from it. Tonight I made a choice I should have made years ago. I chose myself, not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted applause, but because dignity is not something you beg for. It is something you reclaim. And if you are listening right now, maybe there is a part of your story that feels familiar. Maybe you have walked on eggshells trying to keep the peace. Maybe you have swallowed your hurt so others could stay comfortable. Maybe you have stayed quiet because speaking up felt dangerous. If that is you, hear me when I say this. Your voice matters. Your boundaries matter. Your healing matters. You are allowed to walk away from people who refuse to treat you with basic decency. You are allowed to outgrow the version of yourself that settled for less. And you are allowed to rewrite the ending of your story at any moment you choose. So tell me, what chapter are you ready to close, and what new one are you brave enough to open?